What's up everybody, my name is Bobby and today I'm going to be giving you guys a little bit different of a video. So for the last couple years I actually was a TV salesman and one thing that I found was that TVs today are extremely complicated, and every time I would be with a customer who hadn't gotten a new TV in a long time, they would always tell me how much they appreciated me breaking down all the different styles of TVs, what the differences are in almost layman terms, in a way that people who don't care about this stuff could easily understand. And so I decided I wanted to make a video for any of you out there who potentially don't care for all the really, highbrow technical mumbo jumbo, and you really just want somebody to tell you what the differences are, what does this mean, what does that mean. Basically just break down the differences between the different styles of TVs and give you the current lay of the landscape. So to kind of start things off, there are two main types of TV technologies that are on the market today. And within those two different types of TV technologies, there's a couple different subcategories. So I'm gonna kind of touch on both of those two main arcs and give you guys kind of the rundown of how they break out. So the first of these two technologies is LED technology. So LED TVs, they're what we've been using for years. They're what we're used to. Within LEDs, there's a couple different categories. But that's kind of the first one that we want to talk about is LEDs. Now, the second category of TVs are what's known as OLED televisions, which is a newer technology. There's definitely some benefits to that compared to LEDs. LEDs have some benefits over OLEDs, and we'll kind of get into what those are, but just to kind of as a starting point, there's LEDs and OLEDs. So starting with that first category I mentioned, LED TVs, there's a couple different things that distinguish what makes a good LED TV and what makes a bad LED TV, and I'm definitely going to touch on that. I think kind of the easiest way to break it down is the general rule of thumb is the more light the TV has creating the image that you're looking at, the better the picture ends up looking. So within the different LED camps, the two main styles that we want to look at are what's called Edgelit LED TVs, where kind of like how the name sounds, there's strips of light either along the top or the sides of the TV that are actually sending light from the edges to create the image that you're seeing. Now, the other style, which people kind of consider to be better, are what's called backlit LED TVs. So kind of like how the name sounds, all of the lights creating the image are actually behind the panel, and picture kind of like a tic-tac-toe grid, if you will. So it's kind of like a checkerboard of lights behind the screen. The reason why that's better is when you have an edgelit LED and the light is being sent from the sides, it actually has to send light behind the black areas. So say you're watching like a movie where there's a dark scene, there's a bunch of black on the panel, and then there's like an image in the middle. When it wants to make that image in the center, it actually has to send light from the edge behind the black area, and what ends up happening is the black area almost looks kind of gray, or just like there's like a light behind it. It's kind of hard to explain, and hopefully I'm showing some good graphics demonstrating this. But Edgelit TVs, you're gonna get that grayish bleed of light behind the black areas, which is worse in terms of contrast. So contrast is the difference between like the blacks and the whites. So when you're watching something and there's a really dark area and a really light area, the image will look better if those two are different and well distinguished between the two. So the reason why a backlit LED is better is because, say there's all that black area that you're trying to have be dark black, and then there's the image that you want to have lit up, you can actually have those checkerboard grid of lights turn on where you want the image to be and turn off where you want it to be black. So instead of having to send light behind that dark area, it's actually just turning off the little grids of light, leaving you with better contrast and an overall better image. Now, there's a lot of different types of backlit LED TVs, which are kind of the best of LEDs. There's kind of a new style that's been coming out the last couple years that are called mini LEDs. You might see that name pop up. What mini LEDs are just even tinier clusters essentially of those lights, so you get even better control over what part you want to make dark and what part you want to light up. But yeah, just the general rule of thumb is if you're looking for an LED TV and you can afford it, I definitely recommend going for a backlit LED as opposed to an edgelit LED. Now, that's kind of the breakout of what LED TVs are kind of looking like these days. But I'm gonna explain another term that you'll see pop up quite a bit when you're looking for a new TV these days, and that's QLED. Now, QLEDs are a type of LED TVs that Samsung basically marketed and pioneered, if you will. But the way I like to explain it to people is just think of it as a regular LED TV on steroids in terms of color. So a QLED TV versus a regular LED, the QLED is going to have a much wider range of color. Now, I know that for the hardcore TV heads, if you're watching this video isn't for you, but just to try to explain it, the way I like to usually kind of break it out for people is if a regular LED TV is drawing the picture on the panel with the box of crayons that has 12 crayons, a QLED TV is doing it with the 64 shade box. So you're getting much more shades of green, a bunch more blue, a bunch more red, all of that kind of stuff. It just gives you a wider range of color, which can help the panel look much more vibrant or give you a little bit better detail as far as like the actual color that's being displayed on the panel. QLED is a branding term for what I just described, is that wider range of color. There's other technologies out there that different brands use that do the same thing. It's just QLED, I would say, is probably the most prominent version of it. It's definitely the most popular. But for like example, you know, Sony has their own version of it that they call triluminous display. You know, other brands have their own take on it. But just know that whenever you see QLED out there, or that type of term, basically what that's referring to is it's an LED TV, either edgelit or backlit, but with just a wider range of color. Okay, so now that we understand the difference between an edgelit LED and a backlit LED TV, the next thing I want to talk about is that other big category that we were talking about that I guarantee you'll see in your TV search, that's called OLED. So a lot of LED terms floating around here. I'm throwing a lot at you guys, so I'm going to have time markers down in the description below to hopefully help you jump back to parts that maybe are still confusing to you or that you want to watch again to hopefully understand a little bit better. But like I said, there's the two overarching categories. There's LED TVs and OLED TVs. Within LEDs, the tree breaks out into edgelit, backlit, and then back at the top, within the LED world, the reason why it's a totally different technology is because when I explain that an edgelit and an LED, or an edgelit and a backlit LED TV, the rule of thumb is the more light the panel can produce, the better the image ends up looking. So if you have, like, say for example on the backlit LEDs where you have the grid of lights, the kind of like pockets of light, let's say you have like a couple hundred zones of light behind the actual panel. When you're turning them off and on, it gives you a tighter control of contrast, which makes the image end up looking better. A OLED television, the reason why that's a totally different ballpark is instead of those couple hundred zones of light behind the TV, literally every single one of the pixels across the whole panel has its own light, its own color, and its own power. So when I say every single pixel has its own light, on a 4K TV, that's 8.3 million dots of light across the whole screen. So we're talking about going from a couple hundred zones of light within an LED TV, and then when you jump up to OLED, you get 8.3 million lights across the whole screen. So that difference I was talking about, where if the TV wants to make a part dark and leave a part light, an OLED panel can actually do that on a pixel level. So it gives you a type of contrast that you really can't unsee once you've seen it. I personally prefer OLED panels. They definitely do have their downsides for sure, and I'll touch on that in a minute, but in my opinion, if you take care of them the right way, the picture quality is vastly superior. There's definitely some LED TVs when you get into the really high-end LEDs that can kind of compete, but in my opinion, there's nothing like OLED, and I really don't think there's anything out there that, in my opinion, looks better than the best OLEDs, in my opinion. To kind of put it into perspective, OLED TVs are one of the few things in technology that I've seen come out in the last, decade or so, that if you showed it to somebody who doesn't care about technology at all, is totally content, doesn't have any sort of interest in this stuff, they don't go looking for the newest, best, greatest things. If you show it to someone who has not seen it before, I guarantee you, unless they have bad vision or something like that, 100% of them will see that difference. It really is something quite remarkable making that jump to an OLED panel. So as I mentioned earlier, each of these different styles of TVs have their own drawbacks. There's different versions of them from different brands, and they kind of have their ups and downs depending on which brand you go with, and I will touch on that stuff. But as for the drawbacks with OLED, probably the most prominent one that you'll hear talked about is something called burn-in. And so what burn-in is when you leave a stationary image on an OLED panel for too long, especially on the earlier versions of OLEDs, the image itself, like let's say you're watching the news, for example, and there's that bar that goes across the bottom and it's constantly scrolling across the bottom, and if you leave the news on all day long, that white box is staying on the same set of pixels on the panel for an extended period of time. And then let's say you decide to change it and put a movie on or something like that. Burn-in is where you would see a little ghost image, like almost a very transparent version of it along the bottom of your TV once you've switched the content. So that just means that that image that you had sitting there for too long burned itself into the panel. Now, in early versions of OLEDs, this was definitely something that was pretty prevalent. It was a pretty major drawback. The companies that make these TVs have since spent a lot of time implementing different things to essentially alleviate that concern. And so in my opinion, the current generations of OLEDs, they're kind of difficult to burn in. If you ask me, I'm sure where there's a will, there's a way, and I'm sure there's ways to make it happen. But my experience is if you're watching TV, when you're done, you turn it off. You shouldn't have much of an issue with it. You definitely can get extended warranties from places like Best Buy where that type of thing is covered. So if it does end up happening and you just want the peace of mind, I definitely recommend it. But yeah, so burn-in, that's a pretty big concern that I hear sometimes from people, and in my opinion, not as big of a deal as it used to be. Just take care of your stuff, turn your TV off. Like, you shouldn't be leaving your TV on all day anyway, in my opinion. But that's just one thing I'd like to bring up. The other one that sometimes you hear is OLED TVs don't get as bright as traditional LED TVs. Now, even though they have more lights that I mentioned, the lights don't burn quite as bright as a traditional LED. So, for example, if you're in a room that has a lot of big windows and a lot of natural light, and the light is coming in and shining directly on the panel, sometimes that can be an issue as far as like glare is concerned. On my OLED, the way it's kind of set up is the window is right next to where my TV is, and depending on what the content is, like if I'm playing like a PlayStation game or something, then like the game is at night, and I'm playing it in the daytime and the light is coming through. It is pretty difficult to see. Now, newer versions of the OLED, specifically Sony's new top-of-the-line OLED and LG's new top-of-the-line OLED, both of those actually get significantly brighter than every generation that precedes it. So for those, I imagine this is much less of an issue. But for older generations of these TVs, they definitely don't get as bright. I'd say they thrive specifically in the, it's the end of the day, the lights are, down, or the sun has gone down and you're watching like TV or a movie or something like that at night. That's really where you'll see the OLED shine, especially if you're watching 4K content, where in 2021 you definitely should be watching 4K content. So those are kind of the biggest drawbacks, I'd say, to OLED panels. Then in the other side of the tree, the LED side of things, you're not going to get as good of contrast, you're not going to get as good of shadow detail. The overall, in my opinion, the overall image quality is a step down. Even if it is a 4K picture, you're not quite getting that same rich contrast, which I think makes the biggest difference. But yeah, so they both have their pros and cons. The LED style TVs perform better in really bright areas, so if natural sunlight is shining on it and you have a good backlit LED TV, it can fight that outside light and make the image a little bit easier to see during the day. Those are kind of the biggest things I would say for both of the different sides of the coin. Now, the last piece I wanted to touch on are brands. So in the US, there's a ton of different brands of TVs that you can choose between. Whenever I'm suggesting a TV to anybody, I usually recommend one of the big three, which is either Sony, Samsung, or LG. All three of those brands make fantastic products, from their highest end television down to their entry-level product. Similar to kind of how a car manufacturer like Ford, for example, has their entry-level car all the way up to their premium cars. They just have a bunch of different models within Ford, and each year they come out with like a new version of it, essentially, like the 2020 Focus, the 2021 Focus. It's similar with TVs. So within the TV world, there's the brand, and then they have a bunch of different models, entry level up to their highest end. And each year there's the 2021 version, 2022, and so on. That's just kind of how they roll their products out. So even though I recommend one of those three brands, that's not to say that there isn't, good products from TCL, Hisense, Vizio, all that, Toshiba, the different brands that also exist out there. I just think for the customers that I've helped, you get the best quality, most consistent experience when you choose one of those three. Now, each one of those three brands is kind of known for a different thing, and I'll touch a little bit on that. So starting with Samsung, Samsung is known for how bright and vibrant their televisions are. They definitely have the most vibrant colors out of any other panel, which plays into their QLED branding that you see quite often whenever you walk into any sort of Samsung pad or see an ad or something like that on TV. Their blues are super blue, the reds are super red, the greens are super green. Sometimes people's eyes gravitate towards that look. They like the really vibrant, pop in your face kind of style of TV. Other times people look at it and they feel like it doesn't quite look realistic. So if you're looking at a nature scene, for example, the green is way too green, or that kind of thing. So when it comes to that, that's totally just personal preference. Before you buy any TV, if you have the opportunity, I recommend you go somewhere and take a look at all of these different options that I'm talking to you about. That way you can actually see what the options are and what your eye gravitates towards. But as for Samsung, they're definitely known for the brightest, most vibrant TVs, especially their high-end LEDs. The ones that are backlit, those guys get ridiculously bright. So if you are in some sort of bright environment, a really nice backlit QLED TV is not a bad option at all. Now, as for Sony, Sony is actually the only TV brand that also makes movies. So their whole goal is they want the image that you see on their TV to look exactly how the director intended it to look. So a lot of these movies that we watch these days are filmed on Sony cameras, and with that, I would say Sony typically has the most cinematic, realistic looking picture out of any of the brands. They also tend to have the best motion as well, so the processors in their TV, if you're watching sports, for example, or anything that has fast-paced motion on it, their TVs tend to handle that the best. They also have some of the best build quality in the brand. They really, take pride in the actual build quality of their products, and in my experience, they're pretty phenomenal. But yeah, Sony, definitely the most realistic cinematic look to it. Sometimes people really like the natural skin tones and the way everything looks very realistic, or like how you might see it in a movie. Sometimes people look at it and they feel like it looks a little bit bland. That's totally just a personal preference. But overall, at least at the store that I worked at, pretty much unanimously, everyone kind of felt like Sony was the reigning champ as far as like the best TVs on the market. And if you ask a lot of people, sometimes people feel like they command that premium price tag because of that. But overall, I definitely think they're worth looking into. They make some really phenomenal TVs. Now, as for the third of the big three that I mentioned, which is LG. In my opinion, as far as picture quality, they kind of sit somewhere in between Sony and Samsung as far as realistic versus vibrant. Sometimes I feel like their stuff is a little vibrant. Sometimes I feel like it looks really cinematic. But in my opinion, I think the way LG really shines has to do with their remote mixed with their user interface, or at least used to be their user interface. We don't need to get into that, but their new lineup of TVs, they changed it, and I'm not the biggest fan of the software on their TV, but it still fundamentally is the same. I'm kind of getting on a tangent here, but long story short, their remote is the only remote for TVs that you can get that actually almost functions like a Wii controller does, where when you're moving the TV, or when you're moving the remote, around, you'll actually see a little cursor that pops up on the panel and lets you point directly at whatever it is you're trying to click on. And the reason why I think this makes a huge difference is, I don't know about you, but for me, typing on a TV is an absolute nightmare. I hate it. It's absolutely horrible, and it's mind-blowing that they haven't figured out a better way to do it. LG, with that cursor, it actually lets you point exactly at the letter that it is you're trying to click on, which in my opinion makes typing 1,000 times easier, and honestly sells their TVs better than most other things, in my opinion. It's really, really, really great. I really like the remote. Some people hate it. If you don't like the cursor, you're definitely able to turn it off, but very few people I come across don't enjoy it. For me, I think it just makes the whole experience really, really good. Also, another thing that's really great about LG TVs is, especially on their OLED line, especially this year's version of their OLEDs, all 4 of the HDMI ports are going to be HDMI 2.1, which all that really means is that if you or whoever you're getting a TV for has one of the newer generation video game consoles, they'll basically be able to take full advantage of it, and this is something that's important to a lot of people as far as like future-proofing their television choice. So I know that was a lot of information. I definitely threw a lot at you guys, but just to recap, in my personal opinion, Sony, LG, or Samsung, can't go wrong with any of them. Within those brands, LG and Sony are the only ones that are going to sell that OLED technology, so if you're looking for that, definitely look into LG's OLEDs or Sony's OLEDs. As far as LEDs, all 3 of the brands will sell either Edgelit or Backlit LEDs. But yeah, that's kind of the reason why there's some really cheap 4K televisions all the way up to the super expensive 4K TVs. I know I didn't touch on 8K TVs because that's something that in my opinion is really kind of far off at the moment. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's not really much 8K content you can even watch, and the only time that it really makes sense to me personally to get an 8K TV is if you're getting it above like a 75-inch into the 80s, if that in that territory, because when you have a 4K image stretched past that size, you're getting less pixels per inch and just a whole bunch of technical stuff that basically just means if you want to get a really, really big TV, maybe look into an 8K option. But other than that, I think it's a little ahead of its time, and I don't really recommend it at the moment. But yeah, that's kind of the layout. This was meant to be for kind of beginners or people who don't really know what's going on with TVs or maybe haven't shopped for them in a long time. Hopefully I broke out the time codes well down below. If there's any questions or anything that was really confusing, definitely leave a comment down below, or if you feel like I missed something, toss it down there as well. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, subscribe, and check out the 2 ongoing giveaways and my vlog that I'll be posting down in the description as well. Thank you guys for watching. Take care.